how should we interpret the creation story of Genesis chapter 1? On the one hand, we have a view that sees the creation story in Genesis 1 as extremely literal. It gives details about exactly how God brought the universe into existence and all of life in the world, creatures and human beings. It details a chronicled account of exactly what God did. On the other hand, there's a view that sees the creation story in Genesis 1 as strictly metaphorical, very non-literal, definitely not historical. It's just kind of a view that is there to communicate certain ideas about who we are and what we should do and what our purpose and meaning in life is. And then in between these two views, these kind of polar opposites, there are a wide range of views about how to interpret the creation story. So the question is, how should we interpret the creation story in Genesis? Well, that's a very good question. So we're going to talk about it today on the Science and Faith podcast. Rather than start by trying to convince you that a certain interpretation of Genesis is correct, what I'd rather do is lay out the different perspectives, probably maybe some of the most popular ones, and then let you decide for yourself, make up your own mind about which view you seem to resonate with the most or which view you think is true. I want to start by saying, though, that none of these views are heresy, and that a Christian can be a Christian and hold to any one of the views that we're going to talk about today. So before you get extremely angry or think that there are some views that you just can't hold to as a Christian, I want to make it clear. The views that we're talking about today, there are Christians who follow Jesus, who love Jesus, who will be one day in the new creation with Jesus and probably you, that hold to views about the creation story and the interpretation of Genesis 1 that are different from yours. And so if we go in with this to this discussion with that understanding that there are good Christians who love Jesus, who hold to different interpretations, and that they're still Christians, then I think we can have a fruitful discussion about the various interpretations of Genesis 1. So let's start with the first one, young earth creationism. Young earth creationism looks at the story in Genesis 1 in a literalistic interpretation. Okay, I use the term literalistic because to interpret something literally, it can mean different things. So, of course, we want to interpret things literally, and that is to mean that we want to interpret the Bible as it was literally meant to be interpreted. But we don't interpret poetry literally, in the sense that we don't, when David in the Psalm says, "I am not a man, I am a worm," we don't take that to mean that David was literally a worm and that he wasn't a human being. When we do interpret it literally, what we mean is we interpret it literally as poetry. We interpret it literally figuratively because that's how David wanted us to interpret it, as poetic and as figurative. And so a literal interpretation of poetry is to interpret poetry as it should be interpreted. So I use the term literalistic when referring to young earth creationism because what that view does when it reads Genesis is it takes it, I think, more literally than perhaps the text would require of people to take. So we use the term literalistic in that sense, that it takes the creation in account in Genesis 1 very, very, very literalistically. So what do the young earth creationists believe about the creation story in Genesis 1? Well, they believe that the 6 days of creation in Genesis 1 are just that, 6 literal 24-hour days. And the way they come to that conclusion is many different ways, but one of the most popular arguments you'll hear about this is the interpretation of the Hebrew word yom. And the Hebrew word yom, when used in context, a young earth creationist would say, with the phrase evening, or the word morning, or the phrase evening and morning, or with a number, for example, first, second, third, fourth, that word yom in the Hebrew always means a literal 24-hour day. Again, this is what a young earth creationist would argue. And so when we understand how to interpret yom, then we go to Genesis 1 and we read the creation account. And what we see in Genesis 1 is the phrases evening and there was morning the first day. evening, morning, the second day. And so as you read through the Genesis account, then what we have is, from a young earth creationist perspective, is a very literal 24-hour, 6-day creation week. And so that is how young earth creationists would interpret Genesis 1, very literally. And they would also add that when we talk about other areas, and I mentioned this in a previous episode of the podcast, when we talk about days in other parts of the Bible, when we interpret days, for example, when Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, Christ was in the grave for 3 days, or Joshua marched around Jericho for 7 days, we don't interpret those days to mean anything other than literal 24-hour days. So why would we interpret the creation days in Genesis as anything other than a literal 24-hour day? Another argument young earth creationists would use would say that the whole concept of the 7-day week is based on the first chapter of Genesis, because God created in 6 days and rested on the seventh. That's why we have a 7-day work week. And that's reiterated again in Exodus 20, verse 11, where Moses is giving the law to the people of Israel, and he cites in the law Genesis 1, where he says, "For 6 days the Lord labored, and then on the seventh day had his rest. So you shall labor for 6 days, and on the seventh have your rest." If those creation days in Genesis 1 are not literal days, then we might have a 6 million year work week and rest for 1 million years. So lastly, young earth creationists, of course, as I've already mentioned, look to Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, and the giving of the Ten Commandments. So that is a kind of just a quick overview of how young earth creationists interpret Genesis 1 and why they interpret it that way. A second position for interpreting the Genesis chapter 1 is known as the day-age theory. I'm not terribly familiar with this view just because I don't know many people who actually hold this position anymore. Essentially the day-age theory is kind of that. It's the idea that each day of creation week represents an age rather than a literal 24-hour day. Day-age theorists would say day 1 is not one literal 24-hour day, but it could be an indefinite period of time. It could be a week, a month, a year, 10 million years. But it's not a literal day. It can mean anything other than an actual 24-hour day. And that perhaps the strongest argument for this position comes from what is called the argument from the sixth day. So if this day was literally only 24 hours, then there's no way that everything that the Bible describes happening on day 6 could have happened in 24 hours. And so, for example, in ordering Adam to name all of the land animals on day 6, it would have taken more than one day for Adam to name all the animals. And so when the Bible talks about creation days, it doesn't really mean literal 24-hour days, simply because of the things that were to be done and accomplished in a single 24-hour period simply couldn't be done. And so they would argue, day-age theorists would argue that the days in Genesis 1 simply can't be literal 24-hour days. Again, I don't know very many people anymore. I think this was popular 20 or 30 years ago, but I'm sure there are still people who hold to this position, but this doesn't seem to be a growing position. This seems to be more, in my experience, to be in the decline, this view. Another view, the framework hypothesis. This view is far more popular than the day-age theory. And the framework hypothesis simply says that the creation days, as described in Genesis 1, are 24-hour days, but they're not to be understood as having actually happened as 24-hour periods. They're rather, the author of Genesis is simply describing how God created within the framework of 6 days, because he wants to give Israel an example of a 7-day work, a 7-day week. He wants Israel, he's building things for Israel. He's setting motifs, he's setting examples, he's setting some symbology for Israel. And so he's just framing it in this perspective. So yes, the days in Genesis 1 are, as described, literal 24-hour days, but it's not describing the actual events of how God created. Rather, the author is using license and authored liberty to describe something for the benefit of the reader, not because this is historically accurate or true, but because this is a helpful way of thinking about creation. So the framework hypothesis would say. Also, it sees Creation Week as split between two sets of 3 days. And so you have, in young Earth creationism, you have 6 literal 24-hour days. And in framework hypothesis, they see those 6 days, but they say that the author of Genesis 1, as he has constructed creation within the framework of a week, is actually doing some interesting things. So the first 3 days of the creation week are describing how God forms the creation. And then the last 3 days of creation describes how God fills the creation. And so, for example, on day 1, you have God separating light from darkness. And then on day 2, you have the expanse of the heavens and the seas being made. And then on day 3, you have dry land being made. But then on day 4, so then what you have is you have the first 3 days, God is forming things. And then on the next 3 days, God is filling the things that he has formed. And so on day 4, that corresponds to day 1. Day 5 corresponds to day 2. And day 6 corresponds to day 3. So on day 4, God creates the sun and moon and stars, which is what he puts into the skies. He sets the things. So he has formed the light, and now he is filling the expanse with lights, with the sun, the moon, and the stars. And then on day 2, God creates the seas. He forms the seas, but he also fills the seas with sea creatures. And then, of course, on day 6, God creates man and animals, and that corresponds to the forming of dry land. And God fills the dry land with animals and with people. And so for the framework hypothesis view, there's this correspondence that happens with day 1 corresponding to day 4, 2 with 5, and 3 with 6. And the first 3 days, things being formed, the second 3 days, things being filled. And so that's the framework hypothesis perspective, is simply that God is the author is simply describing for his readers things in a certain framework, within a certain perspective for them to understand. It's not to say that things literally happened this way, but rather the author is using this framework of a week to describe something about creation and about God. And then the last view that we're going to look at today is the ancient Near East cosmology view. And this one's particularly interesting and has been gaining a lot of popularity in the last several years, especially since John Walton published his book, The Lost World of Genesis 1. This was sort of the popularization moment for the ancient Near East cosmology view. And so, of course, what this view would say is that this is in no way a literal historical description of what happened or how God created. This is not a scientific account. It's not a historical account. This is simply what's known as a creation myth. Now, for those of you who freak out at the term myth, let me just quickly qualify this. A myth, or more specifically a creation myth, is not a lie. Okay, myth in this context is not referring to a lie, as in something that's not true. A creation myth is where we get the term a creation mythology. That is a story about the origins of the universe. So when we use the term myth, this is not talking about this is a lie. What we're talking about here is a specific kind of a story that is used to describe the events of the creation of the universe. And so we have a creation myth, a creation mythology, a creation story about that helps make sense of certain things, particularly in this case, the origin and development of the universe, okay? And so we're not talking about a lie here. It's very important. The ancient Near East cosmology or mythology view, first of all, would see the theme of Genesis 1 as God is the supreme creator who made and oversees everything. That's the point of Genesis 1. The point of Genesis 1 is not to lay out an historical journalistic narrative or to lay out in scientific terms exactly how God created. That's not the point. The description that's given in Genesis 1 is not to describe how creation came into being. It is to describe who brought creation into being. And so the point of Genesis 1, when we read about creation week and all the things that God created and how he did it, those hows are not to describe the historical realities of how they came into being. The how is there to describe the who of God, the who of the creation. So the who of the creation obviously is God. He's the supreme creator who oversees creation. Secondly, the ancient Near East cosmology view sees the purpose of creation as one, again, not as a detailed account of exactly how God made everything, but rather one that is it's a creation account for Israel to understand who God is and who they are. So here you have the nation of Israel. When this account is given by the author of Genesis to the nation of Israel, its purpose was to serve to give Israel a national identity, to give them an understanding of who they are as a people, where they come from, and who their God is, and who they worship, who is their supreme authority for them as a nation and as a people, who gives them their purpose, who gives them their mission. So it gives Israel their purpose and their mission, but then it also gives Israel their God, the being that gave them their purpose and their mission. And so that's the purpose. And that's how Genesis 1 is understood. Thirdly, in ancient Near East cosmology, this view sees Genesis 1 as contrasting other cosmologies. And so you think about it, this makes sense. Israel was for hundreds of years in Egypt. They were influenced by Egyptian thought, Egyptian theology, Egyptian cosmology. They were surrounded by the symbology in Egypt. Israel would have been inundated with this kind of message about Egyptian cosmology. And then, of course, Egypt later on would be in Babylon, and so they would be exposed to Babylonian cosmologies, and they would be taught about the Babylonian mythologies of the gods and the purpose of man and how he came into existence and his purpose and mission in life. And so for God, what he's doing in Genesis 1 is he's giving Israel a cosmology to contrast the cosmologies that they've been influenced by, the Egyptian cosmologies, Babylonian cosmologies, and other surrounding pagan cosmologies. God is giving Israel an Israeli cosmology, a Jehovah cosmology, the cosmology of who God is as the supreme God over everything. He's the God over every God. He's the God over the sun, moon, and stars. He's the God over the sea. He's the God over the dry land. He's the God over humans. He's the God over every other God. He's the God over everything. So he's contrasting for Israel. He's giving them a cosmology that's contrasting for Israel against the other cosmologies that they would have been exposed to. And he's setting himself up as the supreme God, and he's giving Israel a national identity and calling Israel to follow him, not the other gods, not the pagan gods, not the Babylonians, not the Egyptians, but Yahweh, God of Israel. And that makes sense, especially when you read the Old Testament, the rest of the Old Testament, where God is consistently calling them to abandon their idols, to worship God alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The Lord our God, behold it, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then what do we have? We have Israel again falling into idolatry and falling away and serving other gods, serving other idols. And then the prophets have to come and call Israel back to repentance because they refuse to give up their idolatry. And so there's this pattern in the Old Testament, which when we see that pattern in the Old Testament, we go back and we look at Genesis 1, it makes perfect sense in context to interpret Genesis 1 that way, where you see cosmology as a lens to understanding the rest of the Old Testament, and the rest of the Old Testament interpreting Genesis 1 as a cosmology for Israel. So those are the various views on interpreting Genesis 1. I'm sure there's lots of others too, but these are kind of the main ones right now, the most popular views out there. So if you want to kind of wrap your head around what is going on in terms of the latest research in understanding and interpreting Genesis 1, that's them. Those are the main views. You have young earth creationism, which takes a literalistic interpretation of Genesis 1. You have a day-age theory, which sees the days of Genesis 1 as not literally 24-hour days. You have the framework hypothesis, which sees Genesis 1 as expressing through a framework understanding who God is and what he has called Israel to be and to do. And then lastly, of course, you have the ancient Near East cosmology, which sees the Genesis 1 account as a cosmology that distinguishes Israel from all the other cosmologies and calling them to worship Jehovah, worship Yahweh, and to be his people and to fulfill his mission for them in the world. So that's our podcast for today. If you have any questions, you can feel free to leave a comment in the comment section down below. If there's another view on an interpretation of Genesis that you have or that you've read about and you want to share that, you can share that as well. If you'd like to email us some questions and kind of interact via email, you can shoot me an email. The email address there is scienceandfaithdortmund@gmail.com. go ahead and fire that off, and we'll do our best to respond to those emails in a reasonable amount of time. Also, you can check out our website. We're running some articles that are featuring various interpretations of Genesis, and there's lots of other articles on this topic as well, resources that we link to. Our website address is scienceandfaith.de. Go ahead and check that on out. And so that's going to do it for us today. We'll go ahead and wrap this up and say thanks so much for tuning in today, and we will see you next time here on the Science and Faith Podcast.